Understanding diabetes is really about seeing the why behind the disease. I mean, this condition impacts millions of people globally. Chances are you know someone managing it right now, or you might be managing it yourself.
So starting right at the beginning of the material on page 1, the notes establish a very clear baseline. They define diabetes as a group of metabolic diseases characterized by one major highlighted word:
Hyperglycemia.
hyperglycemia,
Well,
high blood sugar. But it's not just a random spike, right? The text notes that this chronic state results from defects in one of three areas. So that's insulin secretion, insulin action, or a combination of both.
right. And establishing that baseline is crucial because it frames literally everything that follows. I mean, the beta cells in the pancreas might be failing to produce insulin, or the target tissues like your muscle and fat might just be refusing to respond to the signal.
Or, as we often see, it's a cascading combination of both those failures happening at the exact same time,
Exactly.
which naturally leads us to page 2 and how the medical field actually categorizes the disease. The notes provide a really sharp breakdown here.
Yeah, type 1 makes up about 10% of all cases, and that's driven by autoimmune beta cell destruction.
Right, leading to an absolute deficiency of insulin.
Yes. Then you have type 2, which makes up the vast majority, 90% of cases. And that's characterized by insulin resistance combined with a relative deficiency.
And there's this massive red cloud drawn on this page of the notes with a crucial clinical flag. Obesity is the major risk factor for type 2.
That red cloud is something we'll need to keep in mind, definitely, because obesity's role here is far more active than people realize. But before we get into those mechanisms, the notes also categorize a few other variations you shouldn't ignore.
Right, like gestational diabetes mellitus, which obviously has its onset during pregnancy.
Yeah, and then there's an entire bucket simply labeled specific types. This is fascinating because it includes genetic defects like MODY, which stands for maturity onset diabetes of the young.
Right.
It also includes cases caused by physical damage to the pancreas, like pancreatitis, and even drug-induced diabetes triggered by medications like glucocorticoids.
Okay, let's unpack this. If hyperglycemia is the final destination, these notes make it explicitly clear that there are several very different roads a patient can travel to get there.
Exactly.
But how do we actually know when someone has officially arrived at that destination? Page 3 gives us the diagnostic criteria, specifically the ADA guidelines.
And it's laid out beautifully like a traffic light. Green is normal, yellow is prediabetes, and red is diabetes.
So for that red definitive diabetes category, we're looking at 4 specific metrics: an HbA1c of 6.5% or higher, a fasting plasma glucose of 126 milligrams per deciliter or higher, a 2-hour postprandial or post-meal glucose of 200 or higher.
Or a random glucose of 200 or higher, but that one actually has to be combined with physical symptoms.
Right. And what's fascinating here is the golden rule that the notes emphasize in bold red lettering right below that traffic light table. Diagnosis requires 2 abnormal test results.
2. Always 2. If you're a clinician or if you're a patient looking at your own charts, you cannot rely on a single data point. A single high reading could just be an anomaly, or a spike in stress hormones, or even a laboratory error.
Yeah, a vital safety check to prevent misdiagnosis. To officially diagnose it, you absolutely need to see 2 of these red light values.
Either from the exact same blood sample or from 2 separate test days.
Now, you mentioned physical symptoms a moment ago, which brings us to page 4 in the clinical picture outlined in the notes. The classic 3 Ps.
Yes, the 3 Ps.
The text presents this as a profound biochemical paradox. The patient is eating significantly more than usual, yet they are rapidly losing weight.
It's wild to think about.
It is. The notes divide this phenomenon into 2 distinct cycles: the water cycle and the energy cycle. Let's look at the water cycle first. When that hyperglycemia pushes blood glucose above a critical threshold of about 180 milligrams per deciliter, the kidneys can't reabsorb it all.
Right, so it spills over into the urine, a condition called glycosuria.
And because water chemically loves to follow glucose, this causes osmotic diuresis. You lose massive amounts of fluid. That's your first P, polyuria.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the body is an incredibly sensitive, interconnected system. Because of that massive fluid loss from polyuria, the blood volume drops and the patient becomes severely dehydrated.
Which triggers the thirst center in the brain.
Exactly, compelling the person to drink vast amounts of water just to keep up. And that is your second P, polydipsia.
Then we shift over to the energy cycle. The notes describe this with a phrase that really sticks with you: starvation in the midst of plenty.
It perfectly describes it.
Because there is no effective insulin signal, The glucose is essentially trapped in the bloodstream. It's circulating, but it can't get inside the cells where it's actually needed for fuel. The body's tissues literally sense that they are starving to death.
So to survive, the body triggers catabolism, the aggressive breakdown of fat and protein stores.
Which creates a severe negative energy balance, leading to the third P, polyphagia. Extreme excess hunger.
It's a tragic biological misunderstanding, really. The bloodstream is absolutely flooded with energy, but without insulin to open the cellular transport doors, the tissues are starving. They eat themselves trying to survive, which perfectly explains that paradox of eating constantly but still losing weight.
Which transitions us seamlessly into page 5, the pathogenesis section of our notes. This dives into the actual biological origins of these different types. Starting with type 1, the text outlines a clear equation. Genetics plus an environmental trigger equals an immune response.
Specifically, the notes point to HLA-DR3 and HLA-DR4 genetic linkages. Add a trigger, like a viral infection such as mumps, and the immune system signally turns on the pancreas.
What's fascinating here is the sheer stealth of this autoimmune attack. The notes specify the exact autoantibodies that are formed: anti-insulin and anti-GAD65 antibodies.
Right. They act like homing beacons, directing the immune system to systematically destroy the beta cells. But if you look at the timeline graph included on this page, the clinical onset, those 3 Ps we just talked about, doesn't happen when the attacks start.
No. The patient remains completely asymptomatic until more than 90% of the beta cells are already destroyed.
More than 90%. It is staggering. By the time anyone even notices something is physically wrong, the patient is already dealing with an absolute insulin deficiency.
Now, contrasting that, page 6 shifts to the pathogenesis of type 2. They illustrate this as 2 interlocking gears labeled the twin defects. Gear 1 is insulin resistance, where the tissues refuse to respond to the signal. Gear 2 is beta cell dysfunction, where the pancreas physically cannot secrete enough insulin to overcome that massive resistance.
And remember that red cloud about obesity we saw earlier?
Yeah, the major risk factor.
Right. The notes now zoom in on an imitos, a fat cell, to explain exactly why obesity drives these twin defects. We often mistakenly think of body fat as just passive energy storage, kind of like a biological pantry.
Right, just sitting there.
But these notes illustrate the adipocyte as a highly active endocrine factory. In a state of obesity, these fat cells actively secrete harmful signals, things like resistin, TNF-alpha, and IL-6. These are severely pro-hyperglycemic and drive massive systemic inflammation,
while simultaneously decreasing the secretion of the good stuff. Right. The text notes a drop in protective hormones like leptin and adiponectin.
Exactly. You get this incredibly toxic biochemical environment. And this drives the early stage of type 2 diabetes, which is hyperinsulinemia.
The pancreas senses the resistance and tries to compensate by pumping out massive amounts of insulin.
Yeah, but over time, the machinery just can't keep up. This leads to late-stage beta cell exhaustion. The beta cells literally physically burn out and fail.
To solidify all this, page 7 provides a rapid-fire showdown table comparing type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is typically childhood or adolescent onset. Patient has normal or thin body weight, strong HLA genetic linkage, and insulin levels are exceptionally low or absent.
And it's treated inherently with insulin and carries an acute danger called DKA.
Right. On the flip side, type 2 is usually adult onset, associated with obese body weight, polygenic with no clear HLA linkage, and importantly, starts with high insulin that only eventually goes low.
Treated with lifestyle changes, oral meds, or insulin, and carries a very different acute danger called HHS.
That showdown page is just the perfect summary for conceptualizing these diseases. It emphasizes that while both end in hyperglycemia, they are fundamentally different in their origins and immediate biological threats.
Speaking of those immediate threats, page 8 dives deep into the metabolic chaos of type 1, subtitled Starvation Mode.
The core rule here is no insulin equals glucagon excess. Glucagon is the hormone that raises blood sugar, so with no insulin to keep it in check, the liver essentially loses its mind.
It does. It stops using glucose, so glycolysis decreases.
Yeah.
Instead, it starts aggressively making brand new glucose, increasing gluconeogenesis, and it breaks down all its stored glucose, meaning increased glycogenolysis.
The liver is pumping immense amounts of sugar into the blood, but the muscle and fat cells are totally locked out. The specific glucose transporter, GLUT4, is inactive without insulin.
So you get massive compounding hyperglycemia. Meanwhile, because the cells think they're starving, the body ramps up lipolysis, breaking down fat and protein catabolism, breaking down muscle, just trying to find alternative fuel.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Page 9 takes this exact metabolic chaos and explains the step-by-step mechanism of DKA, or diabetic ketoacidosis, the primary life-threatening danger for type 1 patients.
It's laid out as a brilliant biochemical flowchart. Step 1. The low insulin environment leads to uninhibited, hormone-sensitive lipase.
Step 2. This highly active enzyme causes massive lipolysis, sending an absolute flood of free fatty acids straight to the liver.
Step 3. The liver takes these fatty acids and puts them through beta-oxidation, breaking down the fat, which creates a massive excess of a molecule called acetyl-CoA.
And this is exactly where the critical biochemical roadblock occurs. Normally, that acetyl-CoA would smoothly enter the TCA cycle to generate usable cellular energy. But the notes show a literal road closed sign over the TCA cycle.
Because the specific molecule needed to keep that cycle turning, oxaloacetate has been entirely depleted.
Right, the liver stole it all.
Exactly. The liver has stolen all the oxaloacetate to fuel that rampant gluconeogenesis we just talked about. It's so obsessed with manufacturing new glucose that it breaks its own energy-producing assembly line.
So all of this incoming fat has been broken down into acetyl-CoA, but the acetyl-CoA has absolutely nowhere to go. The assembly line is jammed. So it gets forced down an alternative emergency pathway called ketogenesis.
The liver starts churning out massive quantities of ketone bodies, acetone, acetoacetate, and beta-hydroxybutyrate.
And because these ketone bodies are highly acidic, they cause the patient's blood pH to plummet, resulting in severe metabolic acidosis. That is the exact mechanism of DKA.
It is a terrifying perfect storm of biochemical miscommunication.
It really is. And just to add another fascinating layer to this chaos, Page 10 explains another unique phenomenon in type 1 diabetes, hypertriglyceridemia, or extremely high triglycerides.
The text illustrates this with a drawing of a blood vessel featuring a locked padlock.
Normally, insulin activates an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, or LPL, which acts as a gatekeeper, clearing massive fat particles out of the blood and into the tissues. But without insulin, that gate is permanently locked.
The LPL is completely inactive. Because of that, these massive fat-carrying particles, VLDL and chylomicrons, have nowhere to offload their cargo. They just build up continuously.
The result is shocking. The diagram shows a test tube where the blood plasma literally becomes milky and opaque because there's so much suspended fat just trapped in the circulation.
Which raises an important question, though, and the notes tackle this directly on page 11. If type 2 diabetics also have severe insulin issues, why don't they typically go into DKA?
It's a great question. The section is titled Metabolism in Type 2, Why No DKA? They illustrate the answer by drawing a massive concrete dam holding back a violent flood of water labeled lipolysis and ketogenesis.
The dam itself is labeled residual insulin.
The text explains that even though type 2 diabetics have profound insulin resistance and beta cell dysfunction, they almost always still produce a tiny residual amount of insulin.
And it turns out that tiny trickle is just enough to suppress massive lipolysis.
It's a crucial clinical distinction. For a type 2 patient, their hyperglycemia can be incredibly severe, often even higher than in type 1. But ketosis, it's minimal or entirely absent because that residual insulin keeps the fat locks safely in the adipocytes.
Instead, their primary acute threat is HHS, or hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state. This condition is characterized by profoundly high blood sugar, leading to severe dehydration and high blood osmolarity. But crucially, without the severe acid buildup of DKA.
Okay, so we've covered the acute, immediate dangers. But what about the long game? Page 12 transitions us into the chronic complications with a comprehensive map of damage.
They split chronic damage into two categories: macrovascular, affecting large blood vessels, and microvascular, affecting small blood vessels.
The large vessel damage drives things like coronary heart disease, stroke, and peripheral vascular disease. The small vessel damage leads to retinopathy in the eyes, nephropathy in the kidneys, and neuropathy in the peripheral nerves.
If you've ever wondered why diabetes seems to affect almost every organ system, page 13 gets to the root cause. It features a detailed diagram of a blood vessel focusing on the inner lining, the endothelium.
The notes make it clear that chronic hyperglycemia doesn't just sit passively in the blood. It actively assaults this lining.
The text identifies three main culprits driven by high glucose. Number 1, oxidative stress caused by reactive oxygen species. Number 2, aggressive inflammation. And number 3, a critical decrease in nitric oxide, which is a vital vasodilator that normally keeps your blood vessels relaxed.
The notes explicitly state that this constant biochemical assault causes the inner lining of the vessels to become thickened and incredibly leaky. And it points out that this damage is exponentially worse if the patient also suffers from hypertension or dyslipidemia.
But the absolute masterclass of these notes comes on page 14, breaking down the 4 specific molecular pathways that cause this endothelial damage.
These pathways are dense, but understanding them is the key to understanding the disease. Let's unpack the first one, the Polyol pathway. What is actually happening to the excess glucose here?
In the polyol pathway, the sheer excess of glucose forces it to be converted into a sugar alcohol called sorbitol. The critical problem is that sorbitol gets trapped inside the cells.
It rapidly accumulates in sensitive tissues, particularly the lens of the eye and the peripheral nerves.
Because sorbitol is highly osmotically active, it pulls surrounding water into the cell, causing massive osmotic damage and cellular swelling. This specific pathway is a primary driver of diabetic cataracts.
Then we have pathway number 2, AGEs, which stands for Advanced Glycation End Products. Sounds incredibly complex, but the notes simplify it beautifully. It's essentially glucose permanently sticking to proteins. The glucose binds irreversibly, a process called glycation, which cross-links the collagen in your blood vessels.
This literally stiffens the vascular walls, turning them from flexible, healthy tubes into rigid, damaged pipes. Moving to pathway 3, we see PKC activation, or protein kinase C. Persistently high intracellular glucose abnormally activates this specific enzyme.
PKC activation then triggers a cascade that dramatically increases the production of VEGF, or vascular endothelial growth factor.
Now, normally you might think growth factors are a good thing, but in the microvasculature of the eye, for example, excess VEGF causes new blood vessels to form that are highly disorganized, fragile, and incredibly leaky.
This is a major underlying mechanism behind diabetic retinopathy and eventual blindness.
Finally, we hit pathway 4, the hexosamine pathway. This one is truly mind-bending.
Excess glucose gets shunted into this biochemical pathway, which actually alters gene expression within the cells themselves.
The high glucose levels flip the genetic switches that turn on inflammatory and fibrotic signals. It is essentially giving the tissue genetic instructions to scar and inflame itself.
When you look at those 4 distinct molecular pathways together, you realize something profound. High blood sugar isn't just a number on a lab report that makes you feel tired. It is a literal biochemical wrecking ball, relentlessly swinging through the body's delicate vascular networks.
Which brings us to page 15, the final section of our notes. The summary and key takeaways. It beautifully synthesizes this entire sequential journey.
Type 1 is defined by autoimmune destruction, an absolute lack of insulin, and a high risk of the biochemical traffic jam that is DKA.
Type 2 is defined by insulin resistance and beta cell dysfunction, strongly linked to the active endocrine environment of obesity, and carries a high risk of the severe dehydration seen in HHS.
And the root cause of all those terrifying chronic complications we just explored. Endothelial dysfunction driven by highly specific mechanisms like sorbitol accumulation and collagen cross-linking.
And importantly, the notes leave us with the ultimate clinical goal, written boldly next to an illustration of healthy organs. Keep HbA1c below 7%.
So what does this all mean for you or someone managing this disease? It means the goal of treatment isn't just about avoiding an acute crisis or feeling a little better day to day. The notes explicitly state, control glucose equals protect organs.